They called me a relic, out loud, in front of the entire room, and I smiled. I know what you're thinking. How? How do you sit in a conference room with 26 colleagues watching, while a man half your age uses you as the punchline of his opening remarks, and smile? I'll tell you how. Because in that exact moment, while he was busy performing his cleverness for an audience that didn't yet know better, I was holding a secret that would change everything he thought he understood about his position, his power, and the company he believed he was about to reshape in his own image. He was shocked to his core when the truth finally came out. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Margaret Voss. I am 56 years old. And for the last 30 years, I have been one of the 3 founding owners of Hargrove Blaine, a company I helped build from a napkin sketch into a multi-million-pound operation. I trained the talent that filled those conference rooms. I built the systems that kept the lights on during 4 economic downturns. I made the decisions that nobody else wanted to make during the years when making the wrong one would have cost us everything. And when Colton Marsh walked in as our newly appointed Operations Director, confident and polished and absolutely certain he was the smartest person in every room he entered, he had no idea who I was. What happened next is a story about betrayal, about being backstabbed, not by a stranger, but by the very culture I had helped create. It's about the kind of internal betrayal that doesn't happen around a dinner table, but in boardrooms and open-plan offices and company-wide meetings where your dignity is quietly, systematically dismantled while your colleagues look anywhere but at you. It's about what it costs a person to stay silent when everything inside them is screaming. And it's about the kind of revenge that doesn't look like revenge at all, until the day it absolutely does. I couldn't believe how far it went. The humiliation wasn't a single incident. It was a pattern, deliberately constructed, designed to push people like me out the door with our heads down and our mouths shut. The violation of it, the complete betrayal of what this company had been built to represent, was shocking in a way I hadn't anticipated, even after everything I'd seen in 30 years of professional life. But here's the thing they never see coming. When you underestimate a woman who has been quietly building something in silence, you don't neutralize her. You activate her. Stay with me until the end of this story. Because what I did next, what the documentation, the strategy, the patience, and the one perfectly timed evening made possible, is not what you expect. This isn't a story about a woman who got angry. It's a story about a woman who got even, in the most powerful, most permanent, most completely unexpected way imaginable. And if you've ever been dismissed, shamed, talked over, written off, if you've ever sat in a room where someone looked right through you and lied about your worth to your face, then this story is for you. Let's begin. I still remember the exact moment my hands went cold. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind that starts normal and ends with your world tilted sideways, and I was sitting in that conference room at Hargrove Blaine surrounded by 26 colleagues who suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. The newly appointed Operations Director, a sharp-dressed 32-year-old named Colton Marsh, had just pointed at me mid-sentence and said, loud, clear, no hesitation, "We need energy in this room, not relics from another era." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The silence that followed wasn't just uncomfortable. It was the kind that swallows you whole. Humiliated? That word barely scratches the surface of what I felt sitting there. Margaret Voss, 56 years old, with 3 decades of my life poured into that company. I had built systems, trained talent, survived 4 recessions, and restructured an entire department from the ground up. And in one sentence, this man had reduced all of that to a punchline. He didn't even blink. He kept talking, moving his laser pointer across the slides like he hadn't just publicly shamed a woman who knew this company's DNA better than he ever would. The betrayal wasn't just his words, it was the room's silence. What stung the deepest wasn't the word itself, it was the performance of it. Colton said it with a smile, like it was clever, like it would earn him points with the younger staff crowding the far side of the table. And maybe it did, because a few of them laughed, A nervous, uncomfortable laugh, but a laugh nonetheless. I had been backstabbed in slow motion, right in front of everyone, and the audience had applauded. That's the thing about public humiliation nobody warns you about. It's not just the wound, it's the witnesses. I smiled. Not because I thought it was funny, not because I was okay. I smiled because I had learned, over decades of navigating rooms exactly like that one, that your reaction in the moment of disrespect either arms your enemy or disarms them. And I wasn't ready to show my hand. I let him have his little victory, his little laugh, his little stage. I sat straight, I breathed slow, and I thought, he has no idea who he just shamed. That thought alone kept the fire from showing on my face. The meeting ended. People shuffled out. A few colleagues touched my arm. Those small, wordless apologies that people offer when they're too afraid to speak up, but feel guilty for staying quiet. I nodded, gathered my things, and walked to the elevator. And on that ride down to the lobby, those 12 floors alone, something inside me shifted. Not broke. Shifted. The kind of shift that happens when a person decides, quietly and permanently, that the story is not over, not even close. But here's what Colton Marsh didn't know, what nobody in that room knew, and what was about to change everything he thought he understood about Hargrove and Blaine. There's a version of this story where I walked into HR crying, filed a complaint, and waited for someone to do the right thing. And maybe that version ends with a slap on the wrist for Colton and a forced company-wide email about respectful communication. But that was never my story, because my story had a detail in it that nobody, not even the board members who'd shaken my hand for years, thought to mention out loud. I, Margaret Voss, owned 31% of Hargrove and Blaine. I wasn't just an employee, I was part of the foundation. The company had started as an idea sketched on a napkin in a coffee shop in Edinburgh. Me, a brilliant engineer named Desmond Hargrove, and his business school friend, Roy Blaine. We were young and reckless and completely convinced we could build something that mattered. And we did. We started in Edinburgh, but as the company expanded across the UK and Ireland, our headquarters eventually moved to Dublin, and by then, Hargrove and Blaine had grown into a privately held mid-sized operation with several hundred employees across both countries. I made a calculated decision to step back from the spotlight. I preferred the engine room to the stage. My ownership had never lived on the org chart. That had been intentional for years. I worked behind the scenes, poured myself into operations, systems, people, operating as the company's senior operational architect, rather than as a named principal. Most newer executives knew my name, but not my stake. My ownership sat quietly in private documents, not in the briefings given to incoming directors. And over time, the new faces that joined simply assumed I was a senior manager. Nobody corrected them, not even me. The truth is, I had been planning something long before Colton arrived. Not revenge, not yet. But I had been developing a new operational efficiency system for months, something that would redesign the way every department at Hargrove and Blaine functioned. It was the kind of thing that could transform the company's output in ways that would show up immediately in the numbers. I hadn't told anyone. Not Desmond, not Roy, not a single soul. I was waiting for the right moment. And Colton Marsh, with all his arrogance, had just handed me the most perfect stage I could have asked for. Self-worth, they say, doesn't need a spotlight. And I had spent 30 years proving that. I never needed Colton Marsh or anyone else to validate my value, because I already knew it. But there is a difference between choosing to be invisible and being made invisible. What Colton had done was the latter. He had looked at my gray hair, my sensible blazer, my quiet authority, and decided I was background noise. That disloyalty, the betrayal of erasing a person's entire contribution because of their age, that I could not let stand. Because what was coming wasn't just a correction, it was a reckoning. And Colton Marsh had no idea the clock had already started. It didn't stop at one comment. I want you to understand that. Because when people hear about workplace humiliation, they imagine one bad moment, one bad day, one bad person who eventually gets corrected. But systematic discrimination isn't a moment. It's a pattern. And Colton Marsh was meticulous about his patterns. Within 60 days of his arrival, 3 of our longest-serving team members had been quietly restructured out of their roles. People who had poured years, sometimes decades, into building what we had. Gone. And not in the dignified way, in the way where you're moved to a corner, given meaningless tasks, made to feel invisible until you give up and leave on your own. The quiet corporate betrayal unfolding inside Hargrove and Blaine was one that nobody wanted to name out loud. Because that's the insidious thing about age discrimination. It wears the costume of innovation. Colton didn't say, "I'm pushing out older workers." He said things like, "We need to future-proof our culture," and "We're optimizing for agility." And every time he said those words, another experienced voice disappeared from the table. I watched it happen meeting by meeting, month by month, and I felt the slow burn of injustice building in my chest, like something that refused to be swallowed down. What made it worse, what made it genuinely shocking, was watching how quickly a toxic culture can spread when it has permission from the top. Young staff who had once treated me with genuine respect started mirroring Colton's energy. Subtle things, talking over me in meetings, assigning me tasks below my level, leaving me off important email threads. I was being shamed in slow motion, daily, by a culture that Colton had designed specifically to exclude people like me. It was a disloyalty to everything the company had been built to stand for, a betrayal of its very foundation. I documented everything, every skipped meeting invitation, every dismissive comment, every restructured role. I kept a private log, dates, names, exact words, with the same precision I'd used to build the company's original operational framework. People who knew me well would have recognized that focus. It wasn't the behavior of a woman who was beaten. It was the behavior of a woman who was building a case. I wasn't reacting emotionally. I was collecting evidence, patiently and methodically, the way you do when you know that justice doesn't come to those who shout loudest, but to those who show up most prepared. And here's what I kept returning to, late at night, reading back through those notes. Every single act of disrespect, every bit of the backstabbing, every small exclusion, it all painted a picture. Not just of one man's bias, but of a structural failure. A company that had been built on the idea that experience and expertise were its greatest assets had allowed someone to come in and dismantle that belief from the inside. The betrayal wasn't just personal anymore. It had become institutional. And that changed everything about what I was planning to do next. Because if the problem was a system, then the solution had to be a system too. And I just happened to have one ready. There's a kind of power that people never see coming, the kind that doesn't announce itself, doesn't argue back, doesn't perform its strength for an audience. It just builds, quietly, consistently, with absolute intention. While Colton Marsh was busy redesigning org charts and running his future-focused workshops and playing politics with the board, I was doing something far more valuable with my time. I was finishing the most comprehensive operational system Hargrove and Blaine had ever seen, and I hadn't breathed a word of it to anyone. The efficiency framework I'd been developing, I called it internally the Voss Protocol, though no one knew that name yet, was built on 3 decades of watching this company work, stall, recover, and evolve. It was designed to eliminate redundancies that were costing us millions, streamline cross-departmental communication, and create a knowledge transfer system that would finally bridge the gap between institutional experience and new energy. Ironically, it solved the exact problem Colton claimed to be fixing, except it did so by valuing what he was discarding. It wasn't just strategy, it was a statement. What I want you to understand about this phase is that choosing silence wasn't weakness, it was discipline. Every time someone dismissed me in a meeting, every time a younger colleague spoke over me, Every time Colton made one of his pointed little comments about moving with the times, I felt the pull to respond, to correct, to remind them who they were talking to. And every single time, I chose not to. I chose the notebook instead. I chose the framework instead. Because I knew, and this is something age teaches you that youth can't shortcut, that the most devastating response to disrespect is extraordinary competence, delivered at the perfect moment. I also started quiet conversations, not confrontational ones, soft ones, with colleagues who were struggling, who felt the new culture chipping away at their dignity. I listened. I documented their experiences too, not to weaponize them, but to build a real picture of what this environment was doing to the people inside it. This wasn't just my fight. These were my colleagues, my team, people I'd hired, trained, mentored. Their dignity was tangled up in mine. And if I was going to reclaim something, it wasn't just going to be my own seat at the table. It was going to be theirs too. The most dangerous thing about me during those weeks wasn't my ownership stake. It wasn't my relationship with the founders. It was the fact that I was paying attention to everything while appearing to pay attention to nothing. Colton thought he had neutralized me, moved me to the edges, made me an irrelevance. He had no idea that from the edges you can see the whole room, and I had been watching, listening, mapping every fault line in what he was building. The payback I was constructing wasn't emotional, it was architectural. And it was almost ready. The company's 30th anniversary celebration was coming up in 6 weeks. Desmond had asked me months ago to be present, to say a few words. I had said yes, not knowing then how perfect that evening was about to become. The venue was Hargrove Blaine's own rooftop event space in Dublin, the one we'd renovated 3 years ago, the one I had personally overseen the redesign of. And on a cool October evening, it was lit up like something out of a film. Champagne, speeches, a string quartet in the corner, about 120 guests between staff, board members, investors, and partners. Colton was there, of course, looking polished and confident, working the room the way he always did. Easy smile, firm handshake, calculated charm. I watched him from across the room and felt completely calm. I had been waiting for this evening for weeks. Desmond took the mic around 8 o'clock. He was never one for long speeches, but on this night, he had clearly decided to do something different. He talked about where the company had come from, the napkin sketch, the tiny Edinburgh office, the early years of near disasters and unexpected breakthroughs. And then he said something that made the room go very, very still. He said, "There is one person in this room without whom none of this, not the company, not the success, not even this rooftop, would exist. And I think it's time everyone here knew exactly who that person is." He looked directly at me. The truth landed in that room like a stone dropped into still water. Desmond was thorough. He didn't just mention my name. He laid it all out. The founding role, the operational systems, the 31% ownership stake, the decisions I had been part of, that shaped the company at every critical juncture. He talked about the mentorship programs I'd run, the crises I'd navigated, the talent I'd developed, who were now sitting in senior positions around that very rooftop. By the time he finished, the room was somewhere between stunned and emotional. I could see people recalibrating in real time, adjusting what they thought they knew. I couldn't believe how different the room felt in that moment. I'd been invisible for so long, chosen invisible, yes, but invisible nonetheless. And now I was suddenly, undeniably, irrefutably seen. Not just seen, understood. And I watched Colton Marsh across the champagne glasses and the flickering candlelight, watched him absorb what Desmond had said, watched the color shift in his face, and I felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction. It was more like clarity. The kind of clarity you feel when the world finally catches up to the truth you've been carrying alone. I stood up when Desmond gestured for me to say a few words. I thanked him. I thanked the team. I said all the gracious things. But I also said one thing that I hadn't planned, that felt necessary in the moment. I said, "The most powerful thing I've ever done in this company wasn't a system or a strategy. It was staying, when leaving would have been easier." The applause was long, and somewhere in the middle of it, I made eye contact with Colton. He was clapping, and his eyes, for the first time, held something he'd never shown me before: respect. But the evening wasn't the end game. It was the opening move. And the real meeting, the one that was going to determine the future of everything, was already scheduled for Monday morning. Monday arrived with the kind of crisp Dublin light that makes everything feel like a decision. I walked into the executive boardroom at Hargrove Blaine at 9 a.m. sharp, wearing a charcoal blazer I'd bought specifically for that day, carrying a presentation I had spent 8 months building. The room held 9 people: Desmond, Roy, 4 board members, Colton, and 2 senior directors. I had asked for the meeting. I had set the agenda. And from the moment I sat down, every person in that room understood, viscerally without being told, that the dynamic had shifted permanently. I opened with the numbers, because numbers in a boardroom cut through everything: politics, ego, personal feelings. I showed them exactly what the current operational structure was costing the company per quarter: inefficiencies in cross-team communication, duplication of effort across departments, knowledge loss every time an experienced employee left without a transition protocol. The figures were shocking, not because I had invented them, because they were real and nobody had bothered to calculate them before. I watched the board members lean forward. I watched Colton very carefully not react. The payback wasn't coming with shouting. It was coming with spreadsheets. Then I introduced the Voss protocol. I walked them through it calmly, methodically, the way I would explain anything complex to people who deserved to understand it fully. It was a complete operational redesign, not a patch, not a tweak, but a structural transformation. The kind of thing that, if implemented, would increase departmental efficiency by an estimated 38% within 18 months. I had third-party modeled projections to support every claim. I had case studies from comparable organizations. I had a phased implementation plan down to the week. The room was silent in that particular way that only happens when people realize they're looking at something genuinely significant. And then I said it. I said that I was prepared to hand over the Voss protocol, every detail, every document, every implementation roadmap, to Hargrove Blaine. But not unconditionally. In exchange, I was asking for 3 things: a formal diversity and inclusion audit of the current management structure, a company-wide mentorship program pairing senior staff with emerging talent, and the creation of a cross-generational collaboration committee with real decision-making authority. The room went quiet in a different way. Not stunned quiet, processing quiet. Colton spoke first, and to his credit, he asked a real question rather than a defensive one. He asked how the mentorship program would be structured, who would lead it, what the accountability metrics looked like. And I answered every question with the same calm precision I'd used throughout. Because this was the thing he hadn't anticipated. I wasn't asking for revenge. I wasn't asking for his head on a platter. I wasn't even asking for an apology. Not in that room, not out loud. I was asking for change. Structural, lasting, meaningful change. And that request was so much harder to refuse than anything emotional could ever have been. The vote came at the end of the meeting, and it was unanimous. The Voss protocol would be implemented, the cultural reforms would begin immediately, and Colton Marsh would report directly to the newly formed Diversity Committee, chaired at Desmond's suggestion by me. I want to be honest with you about something. Power shifts are quieter than they look in films. There's no dramatic music, no single moment where the villain crumbles and the hero stands triumphant in the light. What actually happens is more like a room rearranging itself while everyone pretends the furniture was always this way. The week after the board meeting, Colton received his new reporting structure in writing. He read it in his office with the door closed. I know because mine was open, right across the hall, and I watched him through the glass as the implications settled over him like something heavy and permanent. The reclaiming of my dignity, of our dignity, because this was never only about me, happened not in a single gesture, but in a series of small, undeniable realities. Meeting invitations started including the people who had been quietly excluded. Decision-making processes that had been condensed to a small inner circle were reopened to the broader team. Older employees who had been shuffled to the margins began to find themselves called back into conversations that mattered. I had been backstabbed professionally, systematically, by a culture Colton had engineered. And now that culture was being dismantled, piece by piece, from the inside. The Diversity Committee held its first session 2 weeks after the board vote. 14 people in the room, a genuine cross-section of the company, different ages, different departments, different levels of seniority. Some of them had never been in a room like that before, not because they weren't qualified, but because nobody had ever thought to invite them. Watching those conversations happen, watching people who had felt shamed and sidelined suddenly be asked for their perspective with genuine curiosity, that was the moment I understood, completely and fully, what justice actually feels like. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like rightness. Colton showed up to that first committee session. He could have found an excuse not to, sent a delegate, claimed a scheduling conflict. He didn't. He came, he sat, he listened. And about 40 minutes in, he said something that genuinely surprised me. He said, "I think I've been optimizing for the wrong things." Not a grand confession, not a dramatic reversal, just a quiet acknowledgement, offered into the room without fanfare, that something in his understanding had shifted. I wrote it down later, not as evidence. The case was already closed, but because some words deserve to be kept. What I want you to hold on to from this moment is the following. The most powerful form of payback isn't the kind that destroys someone. It's the kind that changes the structure that allowed the problem to exist in the first place. Colton had been handed authority without accountability, influence without oversight. The system had enabled him, and now the system was being redesigned to prevent exactly that from happening again. Not just to me, not just to my colleagues, but to every person who would walk through Hargrove and Blaine's doors in the years to come. That's what made it justice. Real, structural, lasting justice. But you want to know what happened next, what the company actually looked like once the changes took hold, because transformation sounds good on a slide deck. The real question is whether it survives contact with reality. Change is awkward before it's beautiful. And I say that as someone who has watched enough organizational transformations to know that the first 3 months are always the hardest. People resist what's unfamiliar, even when what's unfamiliar is better. Old habits defend themselves. Egos don't dismantle quietly. But what I had built into the Voss protocol was a deliberate understanding of that resistance. Phased timelines, clear milestones, consistent communication, and enough early wins to keep people believing in the direction before the results became undeniable. The mentorship program launched in the second month, and I'll tell you honestly, that was the piece I was most personally invested in. Because the quiet corporate betrayal that had played out inside our offices hadn't just been about one man's bias, it had been about a broken connection between generations of knowledge. Young talent arriving with energy and ambition, but no anchor to the institutional wisdom that surrounded them. Experienced staff feeling invisible and undervalued, protecting their knowledge defensively instead of sharing it generously. We had created a room full of people who needed each other but didn't know it. The mentorship program was designed to fix exactly that. The cross-generational collaboration committee became, over time, something far more organic than a formal structure. People started requesting joint working groups outside of official sessions. a 27-year-old product designer began working directly with a 59-year-old operations lead to redesign a client delivery process, and what they built together was something that neither of them could have built alone. This is what people miss when they treat experience and innovation as opposites. The most transformative ideas live in the space between them. I had known that for 30 years. I was glad the company was finally learning it too. The shift showed up in unexpected places. In the tone of meetings, less performative, more substantive. In the way feedback was given, more direct, less politically cushioned. In the retention numbers, experienced staff who had been quietly preparing to leave started staying. In the recruitment conversations, candidates began citing our culture as a reason for choosing us over competitors. We were becoming the kind of company people wanted to build a career at, not just pass through. And all of it had begun with a committee, a protocol, and one woman who had decided that being shamed was not the same as being finished. I watched Colton move through these months with what I can only describe as genuine effort. He wasn't a different person. People rarely become different people. But he was making different choices. He started asking questions in meetings instead of leading with conclusions. He began crediting his team more publicly. He made a point in one company-wide communication of referencing the mentorship program and what he'd learned from his own participation in it. None of this erased the past, but it was the kind of evidence that matters when you're trying to believe that things can actually change, not just appear to. And the numbers, when they finally started coming in, told a story that no one could argue with. Productivity, satisfaction scores, innovation outputs, client retention. Every single metric that had been used in that Monday morning presentation to diagnose the problem was now being used to confirm the solution. Hargrove and Blaine was genuinely transforming, not as a PR exercise, not as a box-checking exercise, but as a company that had looked hard at what it was and decided to become something better. I had been part of building it the first time, and now, quietly, I had helped rebuild it a second time. 18 months after that boardroom meeting, Desmond sent me a single message. It said, "The numbers are in. Come see." I walked into his office, sat across from his desk, and watched him turn his screen toward me. Productivity across core departments was up 36%, 1 percentage point below my projection, which I considered almost irritatingly close to perfect. Staff satisfaction scores had climbed from a 54% positive rating to 81%. Innovation output, measured by new process implementations and client solution designs, had more than doubled. And employee turnover among the over 40 demographic, which had been hemorrhaging under Colton's earlier culture, had dropped by 62%. The numbers didn't lie. They never do. But here's what no spreadsheet captured, and what I think matters most. 3 of the employees who had been quietly pushed toward the exit under Colton's early restructuring had been formally reinstated into meaningful roles within the new structure. Not token positions, real roles with real authority, in departments that had actively requested their expertise. One of them, a 53-year-old logistics specialist named Bernard, sent me a handwritten note. He said he had been 3 weeks from submitting his resignation when the committee was formed. He said staying had changed his life. I kept that note in my desk. Some things you don't file digitally. Colton Marsh stood at the front of the company's first annual Inclusion Leadership Forum, an event that the committee had created specifically to celebrate progress and set new benchmarks, and delivered a 15-minute address about bias in leadership. He didn't speak from a script. He spoke from experience. He talked about the assumptions he had arrived with, the blind spots he hadn't recognized until they were reflected back to him. He talked about what he'd learned from colleagues he'd once dismissed. He was not the same man who had called me a relic in that conference room. And the audience, who included some of the very people he had once marginalized, listened with a complexity of emotion that I recognized, because I'd felt it myself. The difficult, necessary grace of watching someone actually change. Self-worth, real self-worth, the kind that doesn't depend on anyone else's recognition to survive. is something you have to protect fiercely during the times when the world is trying to convince you it doesn't exist. I had protected mine. Not perfectly. There were nights during those months when the humiliation felt fresh again, when the anger came back sharp and hot, when I wondered if I was fooling myself. But I kept going back to the work, to the notebook, to the framework, to the belief that the most dignified response to being underestimated is to build something extraordinary and let it speak. That belief had carried me, and it had been right. What Colton had intended as the end of my relevance had become the beginning of the company's most significant transformation. That's the thing about real justice, the kind that leaves something standing rather than just burning things down. It's not about making someone suffer. It's about reclaiming what was taken and using it to build something better than what existed before. My dignity had never actually left. I had just been temporarily the only one who could see it. Now, 18 months later, everyone could. I've thought a lot in the time since all of this about what the word revenge actually means, because people use it to mean destruction, the kind that satisfies something raw and immediate inside you, that lets you watch someone else hurt the way you hurt. And I understand that impulse. I felt it. Sitting in that elevator after Colton's comment, I had imagined several versions of a world where he was simply removed, exposed, humiliated in kind. The same energy he'd sent my way returned with interest. There is a primitive logic to that kind of justice that I won't pretend I was above. But vengeance and justice aren't the same thing, and the distance between them is exactly the width of what you choose to build. Destruction is temporary. It satisfies for a moment and leaves nothing behind worth keeping. What I had chosen instead was construction, a system, a culture, a new way of doing things that would outlast me, outlast Colton, outlast whatever politics swirled through the company in the years to come. The reclaiming of my dignity hadn't required his destruction. It had required my own creation. That's the version of revenge nobody talks about, because it's harder, slower, and far less cinematic. But it's the only one that actually lasts. What I want every woman who has ever been shamed in a meeting, every person who has ever been dismissed because of their age or their gender or the way they look or the life chapter they happen to be in, what I want them to understand is this. Your power is not diminished by someone failing to see it. Colton not recognizing my value did not reduce my value by a single unit. The disloyalty of his assumptions, the backstabbing of his culture, the systematic betrayal of everything the company had been built to represent, none of it touched what I actually was. It only revealed what he was. And those are two very different stories. The truth, and I say this having lived it, not just thought it, is that the most dangerous person in any room is not the loudest one, not the most aggressive one, not the one with the most impressive title. It's the one who understands the room better than anyone else in it, who has the patience to wait for the right moment, and who has already prepared for it. I had been prepared, and when the moment came, I didn't need to shout or shame or destroy. I just opened a document and let 30 years of quiet, dedicated, invisible work speak for itself. That's what real justice looks like up close, not thunder. A tide. Family loyalty, institutional trust, the belief that the place you helped build will protect you in return. These are not abstract ideals. They are the specific things I watched get dismantled, one meeting at a time, inside an organization I had poured myself into for 3 decades. And what I know now, in a way I didn't fully know before, is that institutions are only as just as the people who refuse to accept injustice silently, the ones who document, who plan, who stay, not out of powerlessness, but out of purpose. I stayed because I knew what this company could be, and I was not willing to let one man's unchecked bias write the ending. So here is what I'll leave you with. Real revenge is not making your enemy fall. It's building something so extraordinary in the ruins of their contempt that the world can see, clearly and permanently, who was worth something all along. I didn't destroy Colton Marsh. I created a better company than the one he thought he was running, and I did it with the same quiet, relentless power that he had mistaken, catastrophically, completely, for irrelevance. That's dignity. That's justice. That's the only kind of victory that means anything at all. And that, right there, is what real justice looks like. Not a dramatic takedown, not humiliation returned for humiliation, not destruction, transformation. Margaret Voss didn't burn Hargrove and Blaine to the ground to prove a point. She rebuilt it into something better. And she did it with the same quiet power that Colton Marsh had spent months trying to convince himself didn't exist. The payback was in the outcome. The justice was in the numbers. And the most shocking part? The man who had called her a relic was now standing at a podium, crediting her work as the reason the company had become what it was. But here's the question I want to leave you with. And I want you to sit with this genuinely because it matters. Have you ever been the Margaret in this story? Have you ever sat in a room where someone looked at you, your age, your background, your gender, your chapter of life, and decided your value before you ever opened your mouth? Have you ever been backstabbed not by an enemy, but by someone who simply didn't see you clearly enough to recognize what they were taking from you? Because if you have, I want you to know something. That moment does not define your worth. What you choose to build in response does. Drop a comment below right now. Tell me, have you ever been dismissed, shamed, or underestimated at work or in your personal life? What did you do with it? Did you walk away, or did you build something out of it the way Margaret did? Your story matters. Someone else reading it might be sitting exactly where you once sat, in that elevator, alone, deciding what kind of ending to write. Your words could be the thing that reminds them they're not done yet. Share it. I mean that. And if this story moved something in you, if it made you think differently about power, patience, and what real justice actually looks like, then you already know there's more where this came from. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications. Because this channel is not about easy answers or surface-level drama. It's about the stories that get at something real. The betrayals that reshape you, the reckonings that transform you, the moments that prove your self-worth was never actually in someone else's hands to give or take. That's what we do here, and you don't want to miss what's coming next.